Okay, 503. Rita, go ahead and introduce yourself and introduce Chad.
Great. Thanks so much, Lee. Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're so pleased to have you with us today. My name is Rita Frost, and I'm the campaigns director at Dogwood Alliance. Dogwood Alliance works with John Muir Project on a number of issues relating to valuing standing forests. So I'm really thrilled to introduce to y'all Chad Hanson. He is a research ecologist, and he's also the director of John Muir Project. And Chad has spent decades gathering and analyzing evidence of what forests do and what fires do to them. He is here with us for an hour this evening to talk about his findings from his newly released book, Smokescreen, Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. These findings include the complex relationship between forest and climate, what makes fires burn hottest, most frequently, and why, successful ways for communities to protect against wildfire damage. His conclusions and findings are remarkably different from what you might hear from the media, elected officials, or even the US Forest Service. Chad co-founded the John Muir Project in 1996. He first became involved with national forest protection after hiking the 2,700-mile length of the Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada with his older brother in 1989. During this hike, he witnessed firsthand the devastation caused by rampant commercial logging on our national forests in California, Oregon, and Washington. In 2003, Chad returned to school and earned his PhD in ecology from UC Davis in 2007 with a research focus on forest and fire ecology. Even for those living outside of the Rockies, wildfire is everybody's problem, especially as it relates to climate change. Industrial logging in the United States emits 10 times more carbon than fire and tree mortality from native beetles combined. So let's sit back and hear the truth about forest and wildfire and get a bigger picture of where the real problem is. Chad, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rita. Appreciate that. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Chad Hanson, Forest and Fire Ecologist with John Muir Project, and I'm going to be talking about key forest, fire, and climate issues tonight. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully that goes just fine. And I'll turn off my video for bandwidth reasons. And can everyone see my screen okay?
Looking good.
All right. Good. All right. Well, I'm going to focus on some of the key themes in my book, Smokescreen, Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. And I'll focus on a couple of really central ones that come up a lot. I deal with a number of different issues in the book, but I'm going to deal with three main ones tonight. First off, for context, as Rita mentioned, I got involved in this issue after hiking the Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada in 1989 with my older brother, Kirk. This is us at the Mexican border, just moments before setting off north. That's me on the right there. This is us 3 days from the Canadian border, looking much, much thinner, much more tired, and much less clean shaven. But 3 days later, we reached Canada. And, for me, the Pacific Crest Trail was a transformational experience because I didn't know anything about what was happening on our national forests or in forests in general. On private lands, I was not politically involved. I was very naive about these issues. And, as we reached the northern Sierra Nevada, we began to see all the devastation from logging on national forests and then even more so into Oregon and Washington on public lands. And I decided that I needed to get involved, and this is what I was going to do with my life. And I got back and changed career direction. I've been doing this work, this forest protection work ever since. So I'm going to talk just for a moment here about a key thing. And this is something, of course, that's a major issue in the Western United States, but is not just a Western issue, which is protecting homes and communities from wildfire. And of course, that message was driven home, tragically in 2016 in the fire that just devastated parts of Gatlinburg, Tennessee, So we know that while this is a very, very present issue in fire season in California, it's also an issue and can be an issue in the eastern forest. Bottom line is this: whether you're talking about the West or the East, the only effective way to protect a home from wildfire is to focus on the home itself in terms of what we call home hardening, like ember-proof vents to prevent those embers driven by the winds from floating into an old attic vent. We need those modern fine wire mesh vents to prevent that. Rain gutter guards to prevent an ember from landing in a rain gutter and igniting the dry leaves and pine needles next to the roof. And then defensible space pruning, which is really, it's not about cutting down mature trees. It's about removing lower limbs, removing dry grass next to the house, preventing dense pockets of small trees right next to the house. It's really, really simple stuff. It's pretty light touch. It's kind of a less is more thing, but it makes a huge difference. When these things are done, it basically massively increases the probability that a house will survive a wildfire. And the reason this is important, the reason this matters so much, not just from a human safety standpoint, but also from a biodiversity and a climate change standpoint, is that what the science is telling us is that any vegetation management beyond 100 feet from homes has no additional benefit in terms of home survival in a wildland fire. It's all about the home itself and 100 feet from homes, mostly the first 30 feet around the house. And so that means we don't need to and shouldn't be removing a bunch of vegetation out in the wildlands. All that's doing is messing up the climate and harming biodiversity and diverting scarce resources away from communities. We saw the tragic consequences of that in 2018 in Northern California with the Camp Fire. Burned in the first 6 hours through several thousand acres that had been heavily logged in the previous decade, post-fire logging and commercial thinning. And it was all done ostensibly as fuel reduction, quite a ways from homes in the town of Paradise. And the community was told that this fuel reduction, which was really just a commercial logging, that would somehow stop a fire. The fire would burn so lightly that suppression crews could easily put it out, and they didn't need to worry. So people didn't do their defensible space. They didn't do their home hardening. They thought it was a wildlands issue, not a community and home issue. And the fire burned the most rapidly and most intensely through those logged areas and reached the town of Paradise much, much quicker than it otherwise would have because of all that logging, that so-called fuel reduction. And over 14,000 homes were burned and 86 people lost their lives. This was overwhelmingly preventable. This did not need to happen. And if we had focused our resources and attention on the community itself, as opposed to logging industry, self-serving justifications, it could have been prevented. We saw the same thing earlier this summer in two of the largest fires in California this year, the Caldor fire in the central Sierra Nevada, near Lake Tahoe on the eastern side there. All those orange and yellow, light orange and dark orange areas, that's previous logging. That's mostly commercial thinning. The fire just swept right through those areas, usually more rapidly than unlogged forests. And in fact, that town of Grizzly Flats on the western side there that you can see, there was several thousand acres of logging, commercial thinning on national forest lands that we opposed. We asked them not to do it. They did it anyway. The fire swept through that very rapidly and burned down the town of Grizzly Flats. Now there's very little of it left. Same thing in the Dixie fire, almost 1 million acre fire this year, big fire, not unprecedented. You know, we had big fires in the 1800s, but you don't have them this big very often. But the thing is, again, look at those orange areas, light orange and dark orange. That's all previous logging, mostly commercial thinning. And the fire just swept right through those areas. Usually those are the fastest rates of spread going through those thinned areas, contrary to what the logging industry and the Forest Service are telling people. And you'll see in the middle, there's a little dot there with a little sign that says Greenville right in the middle. It's a town I know well, used to stay there when I was doing my doctoral dissertation research. And the fire burned through thousands of areas that had been thinned on the ridge outside of town, quite a ways from town. Supposedly that was going to stop the fire and save the town. Well, that's where the fire burned the most rapidly, most intensely, went right through those thinned areas and burned down the town of Greenville. Now Greenville is basically gone. Again, this is entirely or almost entirely preventable. We can't get to 100%. 100% is not attainable, really, but we can get pretty damn close. We're seeing numerous examples where the home hardening is done and the defensible space, and we're seeing 99% home survival or greater, and people and their animals are safely evacuated. If we focus there, we can actually do this. So I wanted to actually talk about that first, because just for me, this is where the focus needs to be. We need to keep the carbon in the ground, and we need to keep the carbon in our forests. We don't need to be managing our forests to protect communities. From a climate standpoint, we know that we have to get away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. But what a lot of people don't realize is that's not enough. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. We also have to draw down atmospheric carbon. The problem is, once we put all that excess carbon up there through our human activities, it stays up there for a very, very long time, many, many decades. And so we have to reduce atmospheric carbon levels because they're dangerously high right now, and they're still going up. The only way to do that effectively, quickly, and in an environmentally beneficial way is nature-based climate solutions. And that just basically means protecting ecosystems from extraction so they can absorb more carbon. And especially, we're talking about forests, because that's where your biggest bang for your buck is. And forest protection can be up to half of the needed climate change mitigation globally. And the US has a huge role to play here, because we are the biggest global culprit in terms of carbon emissions from logging. A lot of people don't realize that. So we need to change direction. We need to increase forest protection. We need to start shifting away from wood consumption and start reducing our wood consumption and moving away from it, just in the same way as we're having the conversation about moving away from fossil fuel consumption and taking steps in that direction. Same thing. It won't happen overnight, but we need to start doing it now in a serious way. A lot of harmful myths are getting in the way of the progress we need to make, though. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those harmful myths. First one I'm going to talk about is the overgrown forest myth. And basically, I'm sure you've all heard various versions of this myth lots of times. It's not limited to the West. It also is used in many places in the East increasingly. And the narrative goes something like this. Because of decades of fire suppression or because of those pesky environmental laws and all those pesky environmentalists who enforce them, our forests are overgrown. There's too many trees and too much biomass in our forests. And that's why they're burning too intensely, or that's why we're having tree mortality from competition or bark beetles or other beetles. And so our forests are unhealthy because there's too many trees. And therefore, we need to roll back environmental laws, increase subsidies for logging, and that will be the way forward to a healthy forest situation. That's what the logging industry is telling us. That's what they're telling policymakers, and so is the Forest Service. The reality is very, very different. There's numerous serious problems with this narrative. First one is the science is clear that in every forested region of the US, we actually have a lot less carbon storage now than we had historically. In other words, the carbon storage is considerably lower than the biological potential. And that's simply due to many decades of intensive carbon removal from logging. And so the notion that we have too much biomass in our forests and therefore too much carbon is just absolutely misinformation from the logging industry. But what this also means is that because we have less carbon in our forests than they can store, that's huge climate change mitigation potential if we protect them and curb logging or protect vast areas from logging. Another key one that comes up is this idea that denser forests burn more intensely. That if you have a forest that has more trees, if it has more biomass, that it's necessarily going to burn more intensely if a wildfire occurs. And that notion, that narrative is strongly contradicted by numerous scientific studies. This is a figure from just one of those studies. And just it shows you on the x-axis there, as biomass goes up, as forest density goes up, that fire intensity overall goes down. And that's that black line in the middle of the image there is fire intensity. Denser forests tend to burn at lower intensities most of the time. And there's other studies that back this up as well. My own research backs this up, and there's others I have cited in the lower left of this slide. And of course, there's a lot that I talk about in my book, Smokescreen. Another key aspect of this myth is if a forest hasn't burned in a very, very long time, if it is, as people put it, missed a few fire cycles in terms of how frequently fires used to occur, that forests are going to burn much, much more intensely. And the Forest Service and the logging industry are using this to say, well, we just can't allow natural lightning strikes to burn because the forest will burn almost exclusively at high intensity if they haven't burned in 75 or 80 years or more than a century. And it's a really interesting issue because every single scientific study that's looked at this at any meaningful spatial scale with actual data from real fires has found this is not true. And so, including my own research, I've published 2 studies on this, and I've got another one on the way. This is a figure from one of those studies, Odian et al. 2010, and TSF just means time since fire. And those black bars on the bottom are percent high severity fire. And you can just see there that the forests that haven't burned in the longest period of time, they actually had the lowest levels of high intensity fire, not the highest. And they're overwhelmingly dominated by low and moderate intensity fire. Now, how is this possible? How are all these things, how can they possibly be true? Because people think, well, it's so intuitively obvious. If you've got denser forests, if they haven't burned in a long time, they're going to have a lot of fuel accumulation. That's the term that the logging industry puts out there. The reality is very, very different. So on the one hand, while a denser forest does have more trees and it has more biomass, theoretically, you might think that there's more to burn. On the other hand, there are countervailing factors that are really key and end up being even more important. And the key one is canopy cover. A dense forest has higher canopy cover. And because of that higher canopy cover, there's a lot more cooling shade. The forest floor stays more moist, more shaded in fire season. And the denser stands of forests actually act like a windbreak against the winds that drive the flames. Whereas a more open forest, including forests where logging has occurred, including commercial thinning, what happens is that reduces the forest canopy cover, and it creates hotter and drier conditions on the ground, and it creates windier conditions. And on top of that, logging spreads invasive combustible grasses and also leaves behind a lot of combustible slash debris. So one of the other key aspects of this is that the proponents of the overgrown forest myth would have us believe that fires are driven mostly or entirely by the structure, the density of the forest. And that's just not true at all. In fact, what we're seeing from numerous studies is that forest fires are primarily driven by weather and climate factors, which means that climate change is a key influence. It's not about how dense the forests are or how many dead trees there are. It's really about whether you have a drought year and hot, dry, windy conditions. And you can't address that with chainsaws and bulldozers. But we conducted a study, my colleagues and I, in a study called Bradley et al. 2016. We did the largest scientific analysis ever done on this on this continent, to my knowledge. We looked at 30 years of data and over 1,500 fires across the entire Western US. And we found, again, that weather and climate are dominant, but we also found that logging is a key secondary factor, but not in the way most people think. What we found is that forests with the fewest environmental protections and the most logging actually have the highest levels of fire intensity. In other words, the fewer environmental protections and the more trees that are removed from the forest, the hotter and faster fires tend to burn, oftentimes toward towns. And that's backed up by lots of other research, a growing body of scientific research, which is finding that, yes, sure, a thinned area can sometimes burn at low intensity. Fire is highly variable at local and small spatial scales, oftentimes depending upon what a gust of wind is doing or not doing at a given moment. But as this figure shows from Cruz et al. 2014, that depending on the scenario, more often than not, the fires are burning more intensely in these thinned areas. And those are the bars that go to the right, as opposed to the ones that go to the left. Again, fire is variable, but on average, at any meaningful spatial scale, these thinned areas are often burning more intensely, not less. And of course, you're also putting a lot of carbon in the atmosphere every time thinning happens. According to Campbell et al. 2012, thinning emits 3 times more carbon than wildfire alone, just because of all the carbon, most of that, the carbon in the trees that are removed goes into the atmosphere almost immediately. So one other key aspect of this is this notion we've probably all heard that dead trees are driving fire intensity, that the fires are burning more intensely because certain forests have a lot of dead trees. That's also mythology. This issue has been studied to death, and the vast majority of the science, including and especially the biggest and most comprehensive studies, are finding that forests with more dead trees and more down logs burn at equal or lower intensities than other forests. And that may seem counterintuitive. This is a graph from Meigs et al. 2016, and that's just what that shows. The year zero on the x-axis is right, when the trees first die. And then for every year afterwards and every decade, there's actually lower potential for high intensity fire, lower fire intensity. Now, a lot of this comes down to water. People don't think oftentimes about down logs being full of water, but they are. They actually soak up and retain huge amounts of soil moisture, huge amounts of water. They can contain 25 times more water than the soil itself. And they function more like giant sponges than they do like fuel. And they retain a lot of that water, even in the middle of a big drought year, even in the middle of fire season. So the other one I'll just mention for a moment here before we go to Q&A is what I call the catastrophic wildfire myth. And I'm sure we've heard of this one in various ways too many times, which is the basic narrative goes, well, fires are burning too hot and they're sterilizing the soil, they're destroying wildlife habitat, and nothing will grow afterwards. And the only way to deal with a post-fire landscape is to clear cut it, what the Forest Service calls reducing fuel, and then plant trees, and they call that reforestation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what really happens after a fire and what post-fire logging and planting really means. First thing is that these fires, even the biggest ones, are mostly low and moderate intensity. The Forest Service always uses red to show high intensity fire areas, and it really draws the eye and jumps out at you. But those red areas here, this is the rim fire, 257,000 acres. Those red areas are only 19.9% of the total. The green and yellow is low and moderate, where most trees survive. And that's 80% of the fire. This is the Wallow Fire of 2011, 565,000 acre fire, only 9% high intensity fire, over 90% low and moderate. This is common. Now, historically, before fire suppression, even in the frequent fire forest types like ponderosa pine and mixed conifer, that before fire suppression burned typically between 25, every 25 to 40 years, sometimes 15 to 20 years, but usually more like 20 or 30. Those forests, even those forests had mostly low and moderate intensity fire, but a significant percentage of high intensity naturally, oftentimes 20 to 35% typically in any given fire. And this has been going on for not just thousands of years, but millions of years, to the point where many, many wildlife species and plant species have evolved to depend not just on post-fire habitat, but specifically on high intensity fire. And this is a map showing some large high intensity fire patches in the 1800s, a map put together over the course of years by a bunch of US Geological Survey researchers in the 1880s. And some of these patches, you can look at the scale there on the bottom, some of these are thousands of acres in size. Some of them are tens of thousands of acres in size. They didn't map small patches, they just mapped the big ones. But it just shows you that these big high intensity fire patches some of them we're seeing right now are not unprecedented. In fact, some of these patches here from the 1800s are significantly bigger than anything we've seen over the past 20 years. And this is just a quote from that report. It just describes what they were seeing: dense stands of old forests that were lightly burned right next to areas where the mature forest had burned at high intensity. And there were standing dead trees and regenerating trees and chaparral. All that complexity, that habitat heterogeneity is really what gives these forests such high levels of biodiversity. And that's something we need to celebrate. This is what is created by high intensity fire patches. Again, it's only 20 or 25, sometimes 30% of a given fire, sometimes less. But it's really significant in terms of its ecological contribution. This is a patch of what I call snag forest habitat, also known as complex early seral forest. And I took this picture 12 years after the Star Fire burned in the central Sierra Nevada. And everything you see there is natural forest regeneration. All of these naturally regenerating pines and fir and cedar and dogwoods and willows, shrubs, and then of course all the standing snags. This is incredibly rich, ecologically important habitat. Turns out snag forest habitat is comparable to old growth forest in terms of native biodiversity and wildlife abundance. These areas are ecological treasures. And a lot of that has to do with the dead trees, because dead trees are really important for a lot of native insects that need dead trees to reproduce. And there are a lot of native woodpecker species that depend on the larvae of those insects, those native beetles, for their food. And so they find the larvae underneath the bark of fire-killed trees, and they eat thousands every year. Dead trees are also softer than live trees, and that allows the woodpeckers to excavate multiple nest cavities every year, which they do, usually 3 or 4. And the female picks the one she likes the best every year, and that's the one where they raise their young. But all the ones that they create every year, each pair of woodpeckers, and the ones they don't choose are available to the dozens and dozens of other small mammal and bird species that need cavities to raise their young, but cannot create their own because they're not woodpeckers, like bluebirds and nuthatches, flying squirrels and chipmunks, and many, many other species. And so you have this rich interconnected ecosystem. And then of course you have a lot of wood warblers and other shrub nesting birds in the understory that thrive in all that natural, lush post-fire regeneration. And so as a consequence, bird abundance, total bird abundance, usually goes up with increasing fire intensity. Now, of course, you don't want everything to burn at high intensity. You want the low and moderate, because a lot of species like that too. You want that mix, so everything is getting what it needs. And interestingly, we hear a lot about spotted owls and the importance of old forest for them. Well, that's true, but it turns out that they forage and hunt. They go out of their way to forage in the snag forest because that's where their small mammal prey base is the best. But if post-fire logging occurs, it takes away their key hunting grounds, and their populations plummet in areas where post-fire logging has happened. Now, in the U.S. in forested regions, we actually have significantly less wildfire now than we had historically, and that may be surprising to a lot of people. It's the gap between historical and current is different in different regions, but it's pretty big in most areas, and it is going upwards. The annual acres burned on average has been increasing since the 1970s, but the reality is ecologically we still are below historical pre-fire suppression levels. And so we don't need to worry that fire is destroying our forests at the levels of fire that's burning right now. Now, I'll just mention also from a carbon flux standpoint, even in high intensity fire patches, only about 3% or less of the tree carbon is actually consumed. And that's really important to understand, because even if trees are killed, very, very little carbon is consumed. Just the outer surface of the bark, some leaves or needles, and some of the smallest twigs, and maybe some seedlings and some really small saplings. Now, for that reason, the current models are vastly overstating carbon emissions from wildfires every single year, because they're assuming that large percentages of carbon in trees is actually consumed in fires, which is not true. And we know this from field research. And none of the current models are accounting for post-fire regrowth and all the carbon sequestration associated with that. And that post-fire regrowth is incredibly significant. This is a picture of me on the right, and famous climate scientist, Dr. James Hanson, on the left. He and I have teamed up with others to fight a large post-fire logging project on a national forest in the Sierra Nevada, where the Forest Service is telling the public that the forest is not regenerating after the fire, that it's incapable of regenerating in these large high-intensity fire patches. And this is what these areas actually look like. We're in the middle of a proposed logging unit where the Forest Service says there's no regeneration. And of course, the natural forest regrowth is 7-8 feet tall. This is what it looks like right next door in the same high intensity fire patch, but where post-fire logging occurred more than 4 years earlier, and where the area was planted right after post-fire logging. because of the soil damage from the logging equipment and all the nutrient removal when the trees were removed, so much damage was done that whatever they planted mostly died. And this is a common problem. This is another area of natural forest regrowth. This is in the middle of one of the largest high intensity fire patches in the entire rimfire. And this is a long ways from any live surviving tree. And this is the natural forest regrowth at 8 years post-fire. This is about 10 feet tall at this point, just for perspective. Lots of carbon sequestration. But right next door, where the post-fire logging occurred 4 years earlier and planting, again, you just have basically damaged ground, mostly bare ground, stump fields, invasive combustible weeds like cheatgrass and slash debris. Now, interestingly, giant sequoias also regenerate wonderfully after fire. And what you can see there in the middle of this picture are a bunch of giant sequoia seedlings. These are mostly 3 to 5 feet tall. This is 4 years post-fire in a larger high-intensity fire patch that occurred 4 years ago in the Sierra Nevada. And so contrary to what we're hearing in the media right now, giant sequoias actually thrive the best in moderate and high-intensity fire areas. And in fact, that's why they've been slowly dying off for 130 years, is because we've been successfully excluding mixed intensity fires from these groves until the last 5 or 6 years. This is natural forest regeneration after a large high intensity fire patch in the Bastrop fire of 2011 in southeastern Texas. I did some field work there a few years after the fire. I took this picture at just 3 years post-fire. Just extraordinary natural forest regrowth. These are loblolly pines mostly, and some post oak. And this was common throughout the fire area in these large high intensity fire patches. But where post-fire logging occurred and artificial planting, in most areas, the planted trees just died. It was the same thing that I'm seeing in the Rim Fire and other fires across the West. It basically, post-fire logging and artificial planting just turned this area into bare ground, invasive grasses, and slash debris. Now, because of all that natural forest regrowth, because the forests regenerate so wonderfully after fire, forests become a carbon sink again in a very short period of time after a wildfire occurs, because of all that nutrient cycling and natural forest regeneration. And what that means is you've got a lot of carbon sequestration, and that accelerates with every year post-fire. Now, our forests are carbon sinks still at the regional scale, but they could be much bigger carbon sinks and absorb a lot more carbon from the atmosphere if we protected them from logging, including getting the Forest Service out of the commercial logging business, but also acquiring a lot more private forest lands into protected public ownership from willing sellers, and providing financial incentives to private landowners to not log their lands. So forest fires are not the carbon bomb. Logging is the real carbon bomb. And that's especially true when you're talking about logging for biomass energy or wood pellets, where the wood is incinerated for energy production. Basically, that emits even more carbon, even more CO2 than coal for equal energy produced. It is a climate change nightmare, and we really need to push back against logging for biomass and wood pellets. This is what that looks like on a national forest in the Sierra Nevada. This is biomass logging in the Rim Fire, where the naturally regenerating snag forest was clear cut. The young trees were clear cut. The snags were clear cut, the shrubs too. And all of it was hauled down to the Central Valley to be incinerated in biomass facilities. We call this clear cuts for kilowatts. And it's something we need to strongly oppose and move away from. But it's not just post-fire logging, it's also commercial thinning that's doing this. This is an area that was commercially thinned on a national forest in the southern Sierra Nevada. And you can see, while some mature trees were retained, most of the biomass from this ecosystem was removed, including virtually the entire understory. And that's a lot of carbon that was taken out of the forest, again, most of which goes into the atmosphere. Because when a tree is removed from the forest, the branches and the tops are not usable for lumber. That gets incinerated in biomass facilities. And then when the log gets hauled to the timber mill, a lot of that carbon ends up as mill residue, and that gets incinerated at the lumber mills for energy production. So a lot of people don't realize logging these days is mostly about dirty fuel. Very little of the wood in a tree that's removed ends up in a lumber product somewhere. In fact, logging in US forests emits 10 times more carbon than fire and native beetles combined. This is a serious, serious issue, and we really need to curb those emissions and also protect our forests so they can absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere. So what does it all mean? It basically means we need to beware of legislation that's claiming to promote the health of our forests or reduce fuels or curb wildfires. Terms like forest health, fuel reduction, restoration, thinning, these are all euphemisms for logging. And we need to support legislation and promote legislation that protects our forests, including public lands, but also ending logging subsidies and doing a lot more to protect private forest lands in both the West and the East. So I will stop there and be happy to take questions.
Okay, Chad, let me take a look here at what we've got. If I can read the chat line. I'm Lee Sloan with the Old Growth Forest Network and have been working with Chad and his team to set this webinar up. Chad, thank you so much. We have a question that starts with sort of the basics. How can forests be best managed to increase carbon sequestration?
Yeah, this is a great question, and the answer may seem quite simple, and it kind of is. The best way to facilitate increased carbon sequestration and storage in forests is to stop removing trees from them. Now, that may not be possible everywhere. Some landowners are not going to want to sell, and they're going to want to keep removing some timber from their forests, but we can provide financial incentives for them to remove less. We can also acquire a lot more forest lands into public ownership. We can provide lots of conservation easements, lots of things we can do to encourage less removal of trees or no removal of trees wherever possible. Now, of course, on public lands, we really should just both federal public lands and state public lands across the country. We just need to get to these agencies out of the commercial logging business and fully protect these forests. Because again, the best way to maximize carbon sequestration and storage in forests is to not remove trees.
We have a question about fire use by indigenous cultures and how does that fit in? The questioner says, I believe they burned a lot.
Yes, absolutely true. So prior to colonization, prior to fire suppression and logging policies, there was a lot more mixed intensity wildfire from lightning strikes, both in Western forests and Eastern forests. And there was a lot more cultural burning by Native American tribes. Both have been marginalized and suppressed in numerous ways over the past centuries and including in the last 100, 150 years. And they continue to be. There are numerous barriers and impediments to both mixed intensity wildfire from lightning and to Native American cultural burning. And many of those are administrative. I believe those barriers should be reduced and removed, and I believe we need more of both.
We have a question from Jeff about how do you respond to the common government claim, which is basically we need to treat the vegetation in the surrounding forest to make it safe for firefighters to operate near homes so they can attempt to save lives and also their homes?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, again, the focus needs to be on communities. And this question comes up sometimes about firefighters. It's really about defensible space and home hardening, and that extends about 100 feet away from homes. But sometimes firefighters, will make the comment that they wouldn't mind a little bit of an additional buffer around that community to be able to operate. I think that's a place where prescribed fire can play a role, not logging, not thinning, but just prescribed fire. You don't need to remove a single tree if you want to do prescribed fire in low fire weather, like early season, early spring. You can do that and have very, very low intensity creeping surface fire and create an additional narrow buffer around a community. That's entirely possible to do. And firefighters, in fact, do that in the middle of fire season successfully at night in order to protect towns. So this is a model that can work. And if it can help firefighters, I'm all for it. But it's not a wildlands issue. It's not about applying prescribed fire across, tens of millions or hundreds of millions of acres in wildlands. Prescribed fire doesn't mimic natural mixed intensity fire in these ecosystems, and it's usually done outside of natural fire season, which can cause all kinds of serious ecological disruptions. But as a community safety measure, I'm all for a narrow buffer around communities.
We have one from Isis who asks for a friend in Plumas County near the big fire there, California, obviously. What role do you see for hand thinning high density stands of young pine trees, if any?
Well, again, it's a good question. And I know the fire very well. It's the Dixie Fire in the northern Sierra Nevada that's burning right now. It hasn't burned much in the last few days. It's basically slowed down a lot. But, it's a big fire. And I think that when we're talking about defensible space around homes, obviously, removing some small trees, seedlings and saplings, especially close to the home, is part of that. And that's where thinning, needs to be focused. Now, I don't usually use the word thinning because that term is become so poisoned and kind of loaded. And usually, 19 times out of 20, it means industrial logging these days. But the reality is that when you're removing these seedlings and saplings next to the home, that is a type of thinning, removing the lower limbs on the mature trees. It's a type of thinning. And that's where it needs to be focused, next to homes, in combination with removing a lot of the pine needles and dry leaves and twigs on the forest floor next to houses. That's successful. It makes a big difference. But out in the forest, it actually accomplish the stated goal. A lot of these denser stands, they do burn more intensely than the plantations, the denser, the little young tree plantations. They will burn more intensely than a mature forest, but they still burn mostly at low and moderate most of the time. And so oftentimes the difference is between 12% high intensity in a mature forest versus 16% high intensity in a young dense tree plantation. And so, in my view, the best thing to do is just leave the carbon in those areas as well, and let fire be what it'll be. Even recognizing that it's going to burn somewhat higher intensity most of the time, but it's still going to burn mostly at low and moderate. Again, because fire is driven mostly by climate and weather, not by forest structure.
From Daniel, question: what do you make of controlled burns in areas in which fire has been a natural part of the ecosystem?
Yeah, so, like I said, from a community safety standpoint, for an additional narrow buffer, I think it plays a role. But let me just give you an example of why it can be really problematic out in wildlands. Controlled burns are typically done, also known as prescribed burns, are typically done in the spring before fire season. Problem is, when you do a controlled burn in the spring, you're doing it in the middle of bird nesting season. So you've got two serious impacts that happen there. Number one, any ground or shrub nesting birds, you're killing the chicks in the nest because they can't fly away yet because it's nesting season. It's not fledging. They're not able to fledge yet. And second, and also that's true of a lot of cavity nesters if their cavities are a little bit lower. Second is that wood boring beetles are not active in the spring. They're only active in fire season. And wood boring beetles, there's dozens of these species. They're native species, and they depend on recently fire-killed trees to reproduce. Now, when you do a prescribed fire in the spring, the woodpeckers will show up because they expect from evolutionary history that they will have food. They'll have the larvae of those wood boring beetles. So they show up, they establish territories, but the beetles don't show up. They don't colonize because the fire is occurring at a time period during the year when they simply are literally not active. And so the woodpeckers don't have food. They starve, their populations go down. Now they're not creating cavities for all the secondary cavity nesters. Now your bluebird population is going down. Your nuthatch population is going down. Your chipmunks, your flying squirrels. Now you don't have as much food for Cooper's hawks and goshawks and lots of other species in the forest. And it has a cascading series of disrupting effects ecologically. That's just one example. But again, there's no substitute for mixed intensity wildfire occurring during fire season. I will say this, that the term prescribed fire has been misunderstood. It actually includes two things. One is fires set by humans for various management purpose. The other is lightning fires that we allow to burn for ecological benefits. That is called prescribed natural fire. People also call it managed wildfire, but I actually like the term prescribed natural fire better.
Kathy asks, what about methane release from decaying dead trees? Presumably she means in the context of climate change, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean, the methane release from decaying trees is extremely small. And so, in fact, is also carbon release. The CO2 release from decomposition is extremely small. There's some really good research that was done on this by Campbell et al. 2016. They looked at this question, and it occurs in tiny increments every year over the course of many decades. And as the down logs decay, as those dead trees fall and become down logs, as they decay, and really the decay really doesn't even start happening to any significant degree until the dead trees fall. And dead trees can stand for decades if they're larger. But when they fall and they start really decaying, it's really small every year, but they're also adding nutrients to the soil every single year with more decay. And those nutrients are essential. A lot of things we don't even think about, like calcium and potassium and magnesium, really essential to maintain the productivity of the forest and therefore its carbon sequestration capacity. So you want those trees decaying, you want them replenishing the soil.
Noel asks, what is treating the forest when a fire is approaching? I've experienced with fire for 38 years, and treating a forest is a new term to me.
Yeah, I'm really happy for the question. I'm adding, and I think I have a whole, in my book, Smokescreen, I have an entire chapter on euphemisms for logging and sort of the way that language has been weaponized to promote logging and mislead people. And this is one that I think I discussed, and if I didn't discuss it, I should have, because it comes up a lot. The word treatment. And it sounds like almost like a health related thing. Like, if you're sick, you need treatment and then you get better. And so this word is used to describe forest management and that we're going to treat the forest. Treatment is just logging. It can be clear cutting, it can be post-fire clear cutting, it can be commercial thinning, it can be a number of different types of logging, but it's just logging. And it's a very, very deceptive term. A lot of people are snowed by that term because it sounds so benign.
Here's one for you. Have you read the Johnston et al. 2021, which says there's a greater extent of wildfire in roadless areas versus managed areas? It says there would be likely more resiliency to roadless areas in the face of climate change, but overall it seems like some misleading messaging could be coming out of that study.
Yes, definitely some misleading messaging coming out of the study, also misleading results. I'm very familiar with the Johnston et al. Study. Main problem is that Johnston et al. Did not control for forest type. And that's a big deal because there are certain forest types that are naturally are more conducive to fire and have larger fires, more intense fires. And some of those forest types are higher elevations, and roadless areas tend to have higher elevations. You have to actually control for forest type, which is what we did in our study Bradley et al. 2016. We controlled for forest type and we looked at roadless areas and wilderness areas compared to general national forests where logging is allowed, compared to private industrial timberlands. And it turns out that once you control for forest type, which Johnston et al. Did not do, that fires are burning most intensely, and you have the most intense, most rapidly spreading fires in the areas where the most logging, not in the protected forests.
Tim asks, or notes that you seem to compare everything to untouched old growth forests, but that doesn't represent the characteristic of significant portions of our forests. Many of our acres in the West have logging scars that are pushing back several decades to a century plus old, and the makeup of those forests was dramatically altered. I understand wanting to protect existing old growth, but is there a role for active forest management in returning those areas to old growth?
That's a great question. So no, I'm not focusing on old growth forest. Old growth forest is really important in both the West and the East, but it's only a component of the forest ecosystem. And in fact, when I talk about forests or dense forests or old forests, I actually am talking about, I use the term old forests or mature and old forests, because it's really about forests that are mature and late successional in addition to old growth forests. Because frankly, there aren't that many old growth forests left. And so most of what we're really talking about that's retaining a lot of carbon, but could retain a lot more, is mature and late successional forest. Very little is old growth. But I'll say this, is that my colleagues and I published a paper in 2010. It's Hanson et al. 2010, where we actually laid out a whole list of active management techniques that have nothing to do with logging or removing trees from the forest. And some of this is, of course, prescribed fire, you might imagine, is one of those, but we're really focused on prescribed natural fire, which does create that heterogeneity, that mix of habitat conditions, happens during fire season. That's what we want more of. Also talking about things like creating snags actively in places where you have too few, because a lot of forests do have a deficit of snags in terms of the minimum needs for wildlife. And so there are lots of ways to do that. Girdling is a simple way to create more snags in the forest. That's active management too. But the main thing we need, and also, of course, anything that involves, getting more fire in forests where they have a deficit, is something that's going to cycle nutrients and stimulate growth. And all of those things are going to help those forests store and sequester more carbon into the future. And that's going to benefit biodiversity too. There are places where you can do things like planting trees, but not after fire. For me, forests don't need to be planted after fires. The forests regenerate naturally on their own. But there are places, and I've seen this in my own research, where I think nature could use a helping hand in places where damage from logging is so extensive. Old logging roads, old landings, some skid trails. Some places where the soil is so damaged that it may be a good idea to plant some trees. There's a role for that in certain places as well.
Catherine asks, any thoughts on prescribed burns in temperate hardwood wetland forests where there's little history of fire? These burns use accelerants, perhaps the mechanical follow-up treatments or salvage logging?
Well, I'm very concerned about those sorts of practices. And I do have a chapter in my book, Smokescreen, about the abuses of prescribed fire and practices under the guise of prescribed fire in eastern forests. And oftentimes what happens is land managers will try to use prescribed fire as a fire suppression tool. And they have misunderstandings about what historical fire frequencies were. They usually vastly overstate and overestimate how frequent fires were, just based on a mathematical error that a lot of land managers have made, which I talk about in my book. And so oftentimes they're using heavy duty accelerants, gasoline and other things, to force fire on a landscape, oftentimes at frequencies of every 2 or 3 or 4 years, which is vastly more frequent than these forests were actually burning when you really look at the ecological data in terms of what they're doing historically. And that's killing a lot of trees. It's impacting soils in ways that are unnatural, especially when those accelerants are applied. And then post-fire logging sometimes happens after this burning as well. And I've seen that also. And so I'm really a big fan of letting more lightning strikes burn, especially when it's in more remote forests, safely away from homes. And we do have lightning strikes that cause ignitions and lead to mixed intensity wildfires, both in the West and the East. And we could do more of that and not suppress fires when they're not next to communities.
A kind of related question from Sam is, I wonder how we can simultaneously message that the problem with industrial logging making wildfire burn more severely and thread the needle of high severity patches being both good and important, but bad when it's the result of industrial logging.
Yeah. So, the main thing about the message about logging increasing fire severity is that logging corporations and the US Forest Service are promoting logging as a way to curb fires. And the key impact there is the carbon removal from the forest, and the fact that, again, anytime you remove a tree from the forest, about 3/4, the equivalent of about 3/4 of the carbon in that tree, or more sometimes, is ending up in the atmosphere almost immediately. And so every time you remove trees from the forest, you're making climate change worse. And so you have a huge climate change impact when they're doing all these logging operations, including what they kind of euphemistically call thinning, ostensibly to curb fires. So it's making climate change worse, and it's not even accomplishing the goal that they claim they want to accomplish, which is curbing fires. And so it's really just a bad and wasteful and destructive practice all around. And of course, the logging is also damaging a lot of wildlife habitat for species that need those denser forests and need dead trees as well.
Let me combine two questions. The first one is, I assume these principles are not being taught in forestry schools. How do we change this? And the other is, there's a lot of misinformation about what is necessary to maintain optimal forest health. Why not establish a clearinghouse center for accurate forest information?
Well, that's a really good comment, and you're absolutely right. This is not being taught much in forestry schools. You know, some of this information is getting through in certain forestry schools once in a while, but it's mostly it's just being kind of censored at forestry schools. It is being taught in a number of ecology programs around the country, which is good, and I hope that continues. And I like the idea of a central clearinghouse for this sort of information. We do our best in the John Muir Project to put this information on our website. We'll try to do an even better job on that in the future and update our website more frequently and add this information. But we do have a lot of information about this at the John Muir Project's website that you can certainly supplement in addition to the information in my book, Smokescreen. And that's at www.johnmuirproject.org.
Here's one last question for you to get us in on the hour from Ken, that I think is important, especially for our East Coast or Eastern region viewers. At what age do temperate forests slow down or stop accumulating carbon? Would you recommend some kind of treatment for such forests?
Well, I really appreciate that question. It's a very, very important question. And it's really interesting. A lot of good research has been done on this. It turns out there is no age at which forests stop accumulating a lot of carbon. They continue to accumulate carbon. Even if they're 500 years old, that stand of forest will accumulate significant amounts of carbon. And one thing that's interesting is that a lot of time, for many years, foresters would look at the growth rings and they see these tiny, tiny growth rings in these old growth trees. And they'd say, oh gosh, you know, it's really not accumulating carbon anymore. Well, you got to do the math on this. You know, if you think about it in terms of geometry, you know, that tiny growth ring on a big tree that might be, you know, 150 feet or 120 feet tall or even taller is a lot of carbon. Just to give you one example, the General Sherman tree, one of the biggest trees on the planet, arguably the biggest tree, depending on how you measure it. It's a giant sequoia, Southern Sierra Nevada. That tree is about 275 feet tall. It's over 2,000 years old. It's 38 feet in diameter. Approximately. That tree every single year is adding an amount of carbon that's equivalent to a tree 1 foot in diameter and 50 feet tall every single year. That's how much it adds. And those growth rings are so small, you need a microscope to see them. But the tree's so big, it ends up being a lot of carbon.
Chad, I think that pretty much wraps up our questions for this evening. Thank you. This was wonderful. And thank you to all our viewers for joining us. And please get your questions to Chad. Chad, do you want to put your email address up there?
I will. And thank you everyone for taking the time to talk with me this evening. I'm sorry, I typed it in incorrectly. So there's my email address, and feel free to reach out for more information. And thanks for all the great questions.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Night, everyone.